Welcome back to GaleForceWins Season 2.
The GaleForceWins podcast is proudly sponsored by Newfound Marketing, a digital marketing agency located in St. John's, Newfoundland. Visit our website at newfoundmarketing.ca to find out how we can help your business grow. Newfound Marketing, a complement to your marketing team.
Well, welcome to another edition of GaleForceWins. We're on a Zoom call today because our next guest is down in Londonderry, New Hampshire. So Jerry and I couldn't make our way down there. I'm Alan Dale. With me, as always, my good buddy Jerry Carew from the East End of St. John's. How are you, Jerry?
Doing well. Yes, Alan, we started this on Zoom. We've had the luxury over the last, I guess, almost, 8-9 months where we've done virtually everything in person. So it's actually kind of nice to get back to our roots, despite the fact that, Steve, I would love to be able to shake your hand. At least the technology gives us the opportunity to be able to say hello to each other and let's hear your story.
Yeah, well, notwithstanding Steve is down there in Londonderry, New Hampshire, there's a heck of a cool connection here to Newfoundland and indeed to Canada. And I would argue, one of the biggest events in the world back 110 years ago. So, Steve, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Steve Kelly. I'm currently, as you said, live in Londonderry, New Hampshire. I was born in 1960 in Burlington, Massachusetts, where I grew up with my 8 siblings, and with my grandparents living right upstairs. They are my Newfoundland connection. They immigrated back in the 30s.
Please forgive this interruption, but this Zoom call had some problems with the connection, and there are times when the audio is not perfect. However, it's at a minimum, and I think the benefit of the entire recording is I think you'll get the gist of it. But I just want to apologize for some of the areas where the recording is not perfect. And what we did was we stopped the video play at that point to let our guest Steve talk.
And so they lived up right upstairs, as I said, from us my whole life. My father owned a 3-family house, and they lived up in the apartment upstairs. So I had unfettered access to them, I guess, for my whole life, which was a great blessing. So I got to know them fairly well.
So eight siblings.
I live, yeah. Well, I guess there's 8 total. I was one of those 8. So, and we also had 2 foster brothers living with us at the time through a good part of that. So,
wow. Are you the middle of the pack, or the front, or the back end, or what?
The front. I'm the second oldest.
Oldest.
There were 5 boys and 3 girls. So, and then 2 foster brothers.
Wow, that sounds like quite a family dynamic there.
Chaos would probably describe it the best. So,
Tell me a little bit about it, Steve. That's fascinating stuff. Not only 8 kids, but 2 foster kids and grandparents upstairs.
Right. Yeah. So we, like I said, we grew up in Burlington on a fairly busy street, and just I have 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and we grew up in town there. I spent, all of my young life till I was 18 in Burlington, went to a mix of schools over the course, the Burlington school system, and then into Catholic school for a few years, and then off to a regional high school in Billerica, Mass, myself for HVAC. That's my primary occupation. So learned that. I spent 24 years in the U.S. Navy, Seabees. Got a bunch of experience in construction and in the trade that I'm in through that. Most of that time was spent in the reserves. I did 3 years active duty, and then went into the reserve program from there, and did the rest of my career 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. So, but it was a great organization. It was a good career. The Seabees do a lot of good work. So.
Seabees do a tremendous amount of good work. For our audience, Steve, why don't you tell us what a Seabee is?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know what that is. Most of the time people look at me like, "Oh, you're in the Navy. Okay, what's what's that? What's a CB? And so the CBs were started in during two out in the Pacific. At the time, the Japanese were march across the Pacific. The Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks had a lot of contracts being executed by civilians on the islands in the Pacific bases, and they were increasingly coming under Japanese. And so the Navy realized at that point that they needed troops that could not only build the bases that they needed, but could also defend themselves. The civilians weren't allowed to do that, so they formed the CBs, I think in 1942, and started sending the first battalions out there to build the islands. And their wartime mission is to build advanced bases and run airfields, tent camps, vertical construction, concrete buildings, whatever, pretty much anything, roads, bridges, you name it, and then be able to defend those things that we built. So they typically the CBs support the Marines in that endeavor. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, I guess.
So, Steve, I've turned off my video here to help with the connection. I'm going to encourage Jerry to do the same thing. So maybe we can speed up the connection because it's a little bit choppy here. Thanks for that definition on the CBs there, Steve. I'm sure a lot of our guests would really appreciate that. And you're right, they do fantastic work. So you took your HVAC career into the Navy, or was it the other way around?
No, I took it in with me. A very good shop teacher of mine at Shawsheen Tech. His name was Bob Diagardi. He, going into my senior year, he had informed my class that at that point in time in 1977 that there were not too many contractors out there looking to hire apprentices in the HVAC trade. And his advice to us was, if you're up to it, go join the military for a few years, and then when you come out, anybody will hire you. And turned out to be a good advice. So that's how I got started in there. So,
wow.
So
yeah. Well, the U.S. has a wonderful relationship with their armed forces, especially when people retire, and as you did, became a reservist and became basically a citizen sailor at that point, right? You were living two lives the whole time. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, I was, living in either Billerica or eventually Londonderry, New Hampshire. We've been here for 25 years with my wife and 3 kids, and then a week, as I said, a weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, I'd go put the uniform on and go hang out with the guys that I was in the service with. So yeah. So in all honesty, I found I tell people I found that the Navy was a lot easier to take in small doses. 2 weeks, a weekend a month and 2 weeks a year was a good mix.
That's fantastic. And of course you get to be part of kind of training that next generation and helping young men and women out that were probably just like you back in the day, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of interesting to, turn around towards the end of that career and realize that when I, checked in reserve unit, I was literally the youngest guy in that outfit, and by the time I was ready to check out, I was one of the oldest. So it's amazing how quickly it goes by. But it was a good experience.
Steve, thanks for taking us through that journey of your military career. That's fantastic. Now, the sea is not far from your blood, and that's the next piece that I want to get into here. Tell me a little bit about, let's go back 110 years and tell me a little story about what happened then.
Yeah, well, so assume you're referring to the sinking of the Titanic. And it's funny, as I look back on this, I remember being a kid, and my grandmother Esther, who was a Myrick, she married my grandfather Robert Kelly, and eventually they settled, in Cambridge, Mass, and then in Burlington, and but they both came from Newfoundland. My grandfather grew up in St. John's, and my grandmother grew up on Cape Race at the lighthouse. And she used to tell me stories about growing up the lighthouse. And one of the things that she mentioned to me, multiple times, she'd talk about the Titanic disaster, and she would say how she could see the night of the sinking, that she was able to see the lights of Carpathia as Carpathia was responding to the Titanic's distress. And I never realized the significance of that at the time. And honestly, I can't say if it's true or not. I mean, I think Carpathia was like 400 miles to the southwest, or southeast rather, of Cape Race at the time, and or somewhere in between there. And I'm not sure if she was looking through a telescope or if she saw something else and it was something else. I honestly don't know. And she's not around anymore, unfortunately, to ask. So. But that was a story that she used to tell me, and among other things, just being there at the light. And it wasn't until years later that I made those connections. I think particularly in 2012, when David Myrick from the Myrick Wireless Interpretive Centre did an interview at the anniversary of the sinking, and he started talking about. I think he said it was his uncle Jimmy Myrick. The family story is that that Jimmy was the one who was in the shack at the time when the initial distress came in, and the two senior wireless operators were out of the shack at that point. One was checking a generator, and the other was doing something else. And that's the story the family has, brought out. And like I said, the first time I heard it was 2012. My grandmother never said a word about that. And he had said that they were all sworn to secrecy. So, if that's the case, I'm sure that's probably why I never did. But it's an interesting connection. Again, I don't know. I can't say whether it's true or not, but looking at at my own genealogy, I started collecting the family history years ago, and started with a family group sheet that my grandmother had created, I believe, and was in my uncle's possession out in New York, and he gave me a copy of it, and that's where I started my research from, and have built on it, over the years since then. And so nearest, looking at history, I can see. I believe the Jimmy that David Myrick was talking about would have been my grandmother's cousin, whose father was, I believe, was out at the light at that point. I don't know for sure, but he described him as being like 14 years old, and this James Myrick was born in 1898. So the math works out, and the timing works out. And my grandmother would have been about the same age as him at that time. So it was an interesting, it was kind of an interesting connection to realize that, they were there at that point when that happened.
Yeah. As the rumor goes, young Jimmy was an apprentice. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And I've looked, I actually did a little more research into him, and I found him on a couple of Canadian censuses, and his occupation, and I forget I'm trying to think, actually I had it written down. He was listed in the 1921 Newfoundland census as a wireless operator. So this 1921, so that was 9 years later. So he would have, he probably was an apprentice, and they did say he was an apprentice at the time. By 1921, he was apparently a full-fledged operator. So it all kind of lines up. I believe that is I've got the correct James Myrick.
Steve, just to jump in there, did you say that your grandmother never spoke about this until 2012? Not once?
Oh, she spoke about it at all. She passed away in 1980 about it. And what I was referring to was David Myrick from Newfoundland. He said that according to Jimmy, who finally broke his silence you know, very late in life when he was essentially ready to die. The family was, he had said the family was sworn to secrecy, and they never talked about it because it was against company policy, I guess, Marconi's policy for an apprentice to be in the shack alone. And they were afraid they'd all lose their jobs if the word got out that, he was the one that took the message. So
Gotcha.
That's the family story, So, but that was the first time I heard it was in 2012 when I listened to an interview that David Myrick did during the anniversary.
Okay. Yeah.
So Jimmy Myrick would be your grandmother's cousin, right? Right. So who else was in the shack that night, apparently?
I've read it a bunch of times, and they weren't Myricks. They were, I forget the names of the seniors now that were in there, but there were two. And one from the article that I had read was a good friend, I guess, of the wireless operator on Titanic. So he communicated back and forth with his friend who was about to die, basically on the ship. And I unfortunately I can't remember his name at the moment, and I don't have the article in front of me. But that was Jimmy Myrick, I think, was the only Myrick family member that was involved in the shack at that point in time, on that night.
So did Jimmy, obviously he kept it pretty quiet that he was in there alone while the other boys were out doing whatever they were doing. As you say, the generator, there could have been anything they were up to. But Jimmy got the initial call from the Titanic, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was, "We're sinking, send help." Is that what it was?
Yeah, I believe the first message he received from what I read was a code CQD. Because it was Morse code. They weren't speaking over the radio, so it was all dots and dashes, and the distress code at that point was CQD, and I believe SOS was coming into play at some point at that time too. But I believe the CQD code was what he received first, and then they communicated back and forth. Once the senior operator got involved and started, communicating with the wireless operator on Titanic to find out what was happening. And, basically they were sinking, and they kept in touch until basically the ship lost power and everything went blank, went dark.
Yeah, so CQD, for our audience, it basically, it's a Morse code, as you so rightly point out, but it means come quick, danger, and then of course SOS, which would probably follow it, means save our souls. So it's a fairly dire message to receive as a 14-year-old.
Yeah, I would imagine, I can't imagine what was going through his head at that point in time. I'm sure he was, saying, "Oh crap, where are the two guys that are supposed to be here?" So, but I, like I said, the first I heard of that was in 2012. I didn't know, anything about that part of the Myrick family connection to to Titanic until then.
Steve, do you know, in your research, do you know if young Jimmy responded, or did he go wait for the other lads to come into the shack? Do you remember?
I think, and I haven't listened to David Myrick's interview in a while, but I think at that point he left the shack and went and found the other operators to tell them what was going on. I don't know whether it or not.
Right. Yeah, you can just imagine what it must have felt like for the operator on board the Titanic to hear a dit or a daw return, to know that there was somebody out there.
Right.
Yeah, that's impressive. So tell me more about Jimmy. What else can you tell me about Jimmy Myrick?
I don't know a whole lot about him. I know that, actually, let me just pull up, I have this stuff in front of me here. So he was, let's see. So my grandmother, Esther, was the daughter of Michael Myrick and Catherine James, and James Myrick was the son of William Myrick and Joanna Myrick. William was Michael's brother.
Okay.
So he was 4 years. William was 4 years than Michael, my grandfather. So and he had 3 children that I'm aware of. James was one, and there was Vincent and Mary were the other 2. So so they would have, that they were cousins, obviously, with my grandmother.
So what brought the family out of Newfoundland and down to the U.S.? What was that? What caused that move?
I believe it was opportunity. I think my grandfather and my grandmother both, they were not together at the time. They met, I believe they met down here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they both immigrated to. And as far as I know, it was opportunity. They decided to come to the U.S. to build their lives, and so they both moved into the Cambridge area, and then they met, they got married, and they lived in Cambridge for a while after that, and then moved out to Burlington, Mass, when Burlington was a one-horse town. Basically, Burlington's it's grown up quite a bit over the years. It's become sort of one of the part of the technology belt of the Boston area off the 128 loop. So, but at the time there wasn't a whole lot there.
Right.
It was very rural. In fact, Billerica, the next town over, was sort of the place where people from Boston went to go for vacation. They would go up to Nuttings Lake and a couple other areas up there. There were a lot of cabins and summer homes and that at that point in there. So it was really out in the country at that point, 12 miles outside of Boston. So now it's basically part of Boston, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, now they're 2 Costco's away.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all kinds of industry in Burlington now. It's really grown up over the years. So that's where they. Go ahead.
So both were from Newfoundland, and both made their way down to the greater Boston area, and met down there.
Right. Yeah, I don't know the circumstances of their getting together, but yeah, I think my grandfather came down in 31, maybe. Hold on just a second. Let me grab my other book. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a picture. Wow. I think that my uncle had of the Cape Race light. I don't know what year it is or would have been. It was just one that he had that I got my hands on. Well, let's see. Yeah, so my grandfather, he came in 1927, actually. I have a head tax receipt from the Farquhar steamship line where he paid $8 to come into the U.S., basically.
Wow. And he stayed. So he came down, paid $8 to get in, and stayed.
Right. Yep.
That's a good
never
deal.
Went back. It was $8 well spent, I guess.
That's quite an $8 well spent. So they made their life down there, 2 Newfoundlanders, eh?
Yep, they did. And my grandfather had, I know he had worked for the SS Pierce Company for a while as a delivery driver, but ultimately he ended up with heart disease, and he was not working, like most of my life there in Burlington. I don't remember him having a job. He was driving for a while when I was young, and then that stopped as well, because he had a lot of heart problems. He had 4 or 5 massive coronary attacks while he was, while I was growing up. So, so he was not, his career was over at that stage. He was basically housebound.
So, Steve, you had two Newfoundlanders living upstairs in the house. Did they talk about Newfoundland much in their conversations?
Not a lot. Like I said, my grandmother would tell me stories about Newfoundland, about Cape Race, and I know one of the things she used to say about what I said to her when I was very small. I guess she was telling me about Cape Race, and I think she showed me a picture of the lighthouse, and I asked her if, apparently I asked her if that was when she was a witch, being a young, 3 or 4 year old or whatever it was when she asked showed me the pictures. So, but as I said, she told me about being able to see Carpathia, and that was really those are the stories I remember. I don't remember them talking a lot about just general things about Newfoundland at that stage.
Now, Steve, do you have any connection with Newfoundland now yourself? Do you ever go up there, or have you been up?
No, we were. My parents went up there, and actually my two uncles. So my grandparents had 3 boys, and so the 3 of them went up to Newfoundland years and years ago. When I was a kid, I think I was probably 12. They went up there, but and actually my 2 of my cousins and their wives and myself and my wife we had a trip all planned and reservations made, and then COVID hit, and that scuttled all of those plans. So we haven't made it there yet, and remains to be seen. I don't know if your prime minister has loosened his grip yet or not. If dirty Americans are allowed up there at this point. So I haven't looked lately.
I think things are pretty open now. Might cost you more than $8, like your granddad, but might cost you more than $8 to get in. But on that note, listen, we're looking for good people to work up here. So it's a two-way street, Steve.
Oh yeah, I hear you. I'm looking to retire in a couple of years, so I think you're barking up the wrong tree.
Steve, I assure you it's wide open here now. We're seeing license plates from all over the United States, California and Florida in particular over the weekend. A little bit of a long haul for those guys, but they're here.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, I imagine, we'll have to revisit those plans at some point. I'd love to get up there and see St. John's and get out to the Cape and see, all of those areas. And I know we have, there are a ton of relatives up there, both on the Kelly and the Myrick side, but I haven't had contact with any of those myself.
I think another stop on the way.
I know David Myrick's related somewhere.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, I say another stop I would suggest would be Gander. I don't know if you've seen or heard Come From Away, but there's some pretty interesting things in Gander. Gander's not a great big place, but there's pieces of the World Trade Center there that were given to the people from Gander. So pretty interesting connection, to Newfoundland and the United States. And I'll just tell you, I remember my grandmother, she was born in 1899, died in 1993. She used to tell me stories about Boston. And it seemed to me she had more of an affinity to Boston than she did to any other part of Canada. And as you know, Newfoundland only joined Canada in 1949, and there's could be a whole other podcast about where Newfoundland could or should be. But I think as Newfoundlanders, Steve, we're always fascinated by the connection between Canada and in particular Newfoundland and the United States. It's just, the Second World War changed the landscape here in Newfoundland from the perspective of military infrastructure being built. That's some of it still exists today and is being utilized. So,
yeah, I actually remember when I was on active duty, they were still sending detachments of Seabees up to Gander and Argentia and other areas, and and the whole 9/11 connection, that was really. I know people in this, down here really appreciated the support from the people in Gander that just opened their homes to all those people that got stuck there. So,
well, I'll tell you a quick story. I'm in Florida in 2002, and it's April, so it's pretty close to when 9/11 happened. And we were in Palm Harbor, and I drove 2 hours to go to this particular golf course, but I didn't realize it was a private golf course. I had my wife with me. Anyway, the security guy was there, and he could tell I was incredibly disappointed because it was where a PGA Tour event gets played, but I wasn't playing. I just wanted to see the place. Long story short, he goes, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Newfoundland." "What?" He wrote a passed it to me, and said, "You can go wherever you want." And he told me he knew what Newfoundland had done in 9/11. And I got to tell you, Steve, I still get goosebumps around that experience, you know?
Oh, sure. Yeah, me too. I just think listening to you, it's amazing. It's, people don't forget, I was, I know where I was, and I know I heard, I started hearing things about flights that had been diverted to Gander, and, how the locals had basically taken people in that, total strangers that didn't even know and put them up. So that kind of stuff, it goes a long way with people.
I'll tell you another quick story. I'll never forget, everyone obviously was riveted to the TV, but that particular day here in Newfoundland was, the temperature was abnormally high. It was close to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And absolutely no wind whatsoever, and the humidity was thick in the air. Around September, the wind and weather starts to get a little tricky here in the North Atlantic. But I remember going down to the golf course just to be on the putting green and try to take my head away from what was going on. And I could see the airport from that, and the smell of the airplane fuel from all the planes that had just landed, and the tails. I mean, I don't know how many planes were there, 30, 40 maybe, just lining the tarmac. So it was quite an experience here, I assure you. But I think it comes back to the point about, why you're on this podcast. Newfoundland is a strategic place in the world, and the lighthouse in particular and the story around Titanic is absolutely fascinating. I appreciate you coming on and telling us.
Yeah, it really is. I'm glad I'm glad you had me on it. I appreciate it as well. It is an interesting place, the first landfall from Europe and all that. A lot of stuff happened there.
Yeah, that is a very significant lighthouse, as you guys have both so rightly pointed out. I mean, for many sailors, for many years, it was the first sign of North America, and indeed the last sign as they were making their way across the Atlantic. It's a fairly significant thing, and of course back in the day that was quite a daunting task to make that trip. Today it's done with ease, as much as the ocean will allow, but it's still a fairly daunting task back then. That's quite a connection, Steve, you've got to our little part of the world, and I hope that you make it up, because quite honestly I'd like to do this podcast in person at Cape Race sometime with you. So
that'd be great.
We can have a deeper conversation. So, Steve, you continue to track your family's history. Are you the genealogist in the family?
Yeah, I guess I am at this point. I've been doing it now for close to 30 years, and have gathered, quite a lot of information, I guess, as far as what the family tree over those years. And so yeah, people come look. The rest of the family tends to come looking for me, I guess, when they have questions along those lines. So it's just one of those things that has come up for me over the years. I got interested in it through my church, and it really sort of lit a fire in me for a little while. It's one of those passions. It's one of those things that once people get interested in their family tree, finding out where they came from, it kind of takes over for a while. I haven't been active in it in a few years because life's been kind of busy, but I still have all the stuff here,
It becomes a bit of a labor of love, doesn't it, to dig in and find out about your roots. I tell you, that connection to quite a historical event in our world is quite something. That you must have been pretty impressive to dig that one up.
It was, and had I not done as much, with the family tree prior, I probably wouldn't have made the connection when David Myrick did his interview, and that story came out about the Myrick connection. So yeah, it's pretty interesting to see. I never knew I had famous relatives.
Did you
in a sense?
Did you ever sit around the mess hall with your CB mates, crack a Sam Adams, and tell that story?
Well, I haven't cracked a Sam Adams in 30 years either, but I have sat around with them, and yeah, there are a few that know it. I've told a few people about it as we've hung out. We just had a reunion actually with all of my reserve buddies about a month ago. So we talk about all those things during those times,
Steve, listen, mate, you great story here tonight. We really appreciate it. You've got a nice connection here to Jerry and I's part of the world. Remarkable, really, and indeed, both New England and Newfoundland have a wonderful connection with one another as well. Steve, what piece of advice would you leave the audience on the podcast?
Oh my gosh, I don't think anybody wants my advice. I would say, I don't know. I guess just be true to yourself and pay attention to those that are in your past, because they kind of determine who you are and what your future is. So it's interesting to see who's back there.
Wow. You say you kicked it off by saying, who's going to want to hear? That's a wonderful, wonderful piece of advice. We can learn so much from those that came before us. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Jerry, your thoughts?
Steve, I've really enjoyed this. Again, to echo Alan's sentiment, would love to sit with you in person. This Zoom connection hasn't been the best Zoom connection. I noticed Alan and I, as you were giving your piece of advice, tried to get our videos back. I'll try mine. Yeah, technology is great until it isn't. But yeah, I think it would be something else to be able to sit with you. And I'll say this to you. When you do get here, make sure you give me some heads up, because if I'm in town, I will make sure to be one of your tour guides and give you the best tour you've probably ever could get in this city. So you and your family are welcome. I think it would be an amazing experience.
That would be awesome. Thank you. I will definitely do that. We do still want to get that trip together, so I'll have to get in touch with my other cousins and see what their schedules are going forward here.
I did an interview with a guy called He created a company called Walking Tour of St. John's. I'll send that to you in email after. All right.
Yep. Okay. Great. Yeah, I think I actually saw that when we were looking. I think one of my cousin's wife had come across one of those, and that might have been the one. So, but yeah, send it along. I'd appreciate it.
Jerry's going to take you in parts of St. John's you probably don't want to go to, though, Steve. I'll tell you that right now.
Well, we'll do the best we can, I guess.
You've probably been down in the South Boston. Jerry will take you to parts like that, too. But it'll all be interesting, nonetheless.
There you go.
Steve, it was just an absolute pleasure to have you on GaleForceWins here tonight. What a wonderful, wonderful story. And young cousin Jimmy sitting in the shack there that fateful night on the Titanic. And while our internet connection might have been a little bit choppy here tonight, you can just imagine what it was like for those poor souls that night 110 years ago or so. And just imagine what they would have went through. Just imagine what young Jimmy must have been thinking when that dit and daw came across the circuit and he had to go find those other fellas. The panic and that must have been rushing through his veins as he was trying to piece all this together. What a remarkable story, Steve. I'm so glad that you came on the podcast. I can't wait to do it in person with you at Cape Race when you come visit beautiful Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me. It was great meeting you both.
Thank you for tuning in to GaleForceWins. That's GaleForceWins, WINS.com.